The rain fell in sheets across the Montana territory, turning the earth to mud and the world to shadow. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the ridge for heartbeats at a time, before plunging everything back into darkness. Jedediah Thornton leaned forward in his saddle water, streaming from the brim of his hat, his eyes narrowed against the deluge. 3 horses were missing good horses. And in these parts, that wasn't just theft. It was a death sentence when winter came. The tracks had been clear enough before the rain heading east toward the ravine, but now they were washing away with each passing minute. "Come on, Thunder," he muttered to the gray stallion beneath him. The horse's ears flicked back at the sound of his voice, then forward again, alert despite the storm. A flash of lightning revealed a figure ahead, moving quickly through the trees. Jedediah drew his rifle from its scabbard and urged Thunder forward. The horse responded instantly, muscles bunching beneath the saddle as they gave chase through the storm. The figure darted between trees, but Thunder was gaining. Another lightning flash showed a smaller horse ahead, struggling with the muddy ground. Its rider kept looking back, clearly aware of the pursuit. "Stop!" Jedediah shouted, his voice nearly lost in a roll of thunder. "Stop or I'll shoot." The rider ignored him, veering sharply toward the ravine edge. Jedediah raised his rifle, aiming above the rider's head, and fired a warning shot. The crack of the rifle coincided with another lightning strike, and for an instant the world was eerily silent. The rider's horse reared in panic. In the next flash of lightning, Jedediah saw the figure tumble from the saddle, sliding toward the edge of the ravine. He cursed under his breath and reined Thunder to a halt, dismounting quickly and securing the reins to a nearby branch. "Stay," he commanded, though he knew the horse wouldn't wander. Thunder had been with him through the war and understood commands better than most men. Jedediah approached the ravine edge, cautiously, rifle ready. The rain was coming down even harder now, and mud slid beneath his boots. He could see where the earth had given way, fresh marks in the soil where someone had fallen. He peered over the edge. 20 feet down, a dark shape lay motionless on a rocky outcrop. Another flash of lightning revealed what he'd been chasing, not a man, but a woman. Her black hair spilled across the stone, and even in the brief illumination, he could see the blood mixing with rain on her face. "Damn it all," he muttered, slinging his rifle across his back. The descent was treacherous, and the rock face slick with rain. His boots slipped more than once, his hands grasping at exposed roots to slow his fall. By the time he reached the ledge, his knuckles were raw and bleeding. The woman lay crumpled against the stone, her breathing shallow. She wore a deerskin dress, torn and muddied with frayed leather laces. Her hands were bound with rope, and a length of chain was tangled around her waist and legs. Apache, he realized, recognizing the patterns on what remained of her clothing. Behind him, Jedediah heard the distinct baying of hounds in the distance. Someone else was tracking in the storm, tracking her. The realization hit him with the next flash of lightning. This wasn't a horse thief. This was a runaway. The woman's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark, deep, filled with equal parts fear and defiance. She saw him and tried to move, a small sound of pain escaping her lips before she lost consciousness again. Jedediah looked back up the cliff face, then down into the ravine below, where water was already beginning to pool. He looked at the woman's bound hands, the chain around her, the marks of abuse on her visible skin. He looked toward the sound of the hounds growing closer. A choice lay before him, as clear as it was dangerous. Leave her to whoever was hunting her, or take her with him, and accept whatever trouble followed. The rain continued to fall, cold and relentless. Jedediah cursed again, then bent and drew his knife, cutting through the rope around her wrists. The chain would have to wait until they reached safety. He lifted her carefully, surprised at how light she felt, despite the sodden clothing, and slung her over his shoulder. The climb back up was twice as difficult, his footing uncertain under the added weight. Halfway up, he nearly lost his grip entirely, his left hand slipping on wet stone, while his right arm struggled to keep the woman secure. Only by driving his boot hard into a crevice did he manage to regain his balance. By the time he reached the top, his arms burned with exertion, and his breath came in ragged gasps. Thunder waited patiently, dark eyes watching, as Jedediah approached with his burden. "I got ourselves some trouble, boy," he said quietly, adjusting the unconscious woman across his arms. The hounds were closer now, their baying carrying through the rain. No time for gentleness. Jedediah lifted the woman onto Thunder's back, then mounted behind her, one arm keeping her secure against his chest. He turned the horse away from the ravine, away from the direction of the hounds, kicked him into a gallop. Thunder seemed to understand the urgency, finding sure footing even in the treacherous mud. They rode hard through the storm, and the woman's head lolling against Jedediah's shoulder, her blood seeping into his already soaked shirt. The rain gradually lessened to a steady drizzle, and the first hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky by the time the cabin came into view. The small structure stood alone in a clearing backed by a stand of pines with a corral off to one side. It wasn't much, a single room with a lean-to added for storage, a barn small enough to be called a shed. But it was his. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away, the nearest town 15. Jedediah had chosen this place precisely because no one bothered to come calling. He dismounted carefully, keeping the woman from falling, and carried her to the cabin door. Inside, he laid her on his bed, the only bed, and quickly built up the fire in the wood stove. The cabin was cold and had the musty smell of a place too long closed up against the weather. In the growing light, he could see her more clearly. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and pain, but even unconscious, there was a certain strength in the set of her jaw. The deerskin dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing a deep cut that had bled freely. Other bruises and abrasions marked her arms and legs. Her black hair matted with mud, and blood framed a face that might have been beautiful in better circumstances. Jedediah filled a basin with water from the barrel in the corner and found a reasonably clean cloth. He began to wash away the mud and blood, his movements precise but impersonal. He'd done this before too many times on the battlefield. The cut on her shoulder was deep, a knife wound, he guessed, not a bullet, but had begun to clot. It would need stitching. He found his old medical kit, a remnant from the war, and laid out a needle thread and a bottle of carbolic acid. When he returned to the bed, the woman's eyes were open, watching him with feverish intensity. She reacted instantly to his approach, scrambling backward until she hit the wall, a stream of words in Apache pouring from her lips. When he continued forward with the needle, she pulled a small knife from within her hair, a weapon he had missed in his initial inspection. "Easy," Jedediah said, raising his hand slowly. "You're hurt. I'm trying to help." Her eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the door, the windows, the rifle leaning against the wall. She kept the knife pointed at him, but he could see how her hand trembled. "No one's going to hurt you here," he said, keeping his voice low and even. "You fell. I brought you to my cabin. You need stitches." She didn't lower the knife, but something in her expression changed. Her gaze moved from his face to his hands, then back again. After a long moment, she spoke her English, broken but clear enough. "You chase me." Jedediah nodded slowly. "I thought you stole my horses. I was wrong." Her eyes narrowed. "You let me go." "You're free to leave whenever you want," he said, then gestured to the window where rain still streamed down the glass. But maybe wait until the storm passes, and let me stitch that wound first." She seemed to weigh his words, the knife still extended. Then her gaze fell on something behind him, and her entire body tensed. Jedediah turned to see what had frightened her, the photograph on the shelf of himself in uniform, standing beside Colonel Blackburn after a successful campaign. When he turned back, her knife was inches from his throat. "You soldier," she hissed the word filled with venom. "I was," he admitted. "Not anymore." Her hand was steadier now, anger replacing fear. "Soldiers take Adsila. Soldiers hurt." Adsila. Her name, he realized. "Not all soldiers," he said carefully. "And not me. I left the army years ago." She didn't move the knife. "Why?" It wasn't a question he'd expected, nor one he had a simple answer for. "I saw things I couldn't stomach. Did things I couldn't live with." Something in his tone must have reached her, because the pressure of the knife lessened slightly. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for deception. "No one marks anyone here," Jedediah said quietly. The words had an immediate effect. She pulled back slightly, confusion crossing her features. "How you know these words?" "I've seen men treat people like property before," he answered. "It wasn't right then. It's not right now." Slowly, reluctantly, she lowered the knife, though she kept it gripped tightly in her hand. "You fix Adsila," she said, gesturing to her wounded shoulder. "Then Adsila go." Jedediah nodded, reaching again for the medical kit. "This will hurt," he warned. She gave him a look that spoke volumes about the pain she had already endured. Adsila not hurt. He worked in silence, cleaning the wound thoroughly before beginning the stitches. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch, though he knew the pain must be considerable. Only the tightening of her jaw and the whitening of her knuckles around the knife handle betrayed her discomfort. When he finished and began wrapping the shoulder in clean cloth, he spoke again. "You were running from someone. They had dogs." Her eyes flickered to his wary again. "Bad men, camp." "What kind of camp?" She hesitated, seeming to search for words. "Prison, not official. Secret camp. Many Apache there. Working ground." "A mine?" Jedediah asked, his brow furrowing. She nodded. "Dig all day. No light. Men with whips." Jedediah finished bandaging her shoulder and stepped back and giving her space. "How did you escape?" A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Guard sleep. Adsila take keys." The smile faded. Others still there. Many women, children too. Jedediah turned away, unsettled by the implications. Unofficial labor camps weren't unheard of in the territories, but they were supposed to have been shut down after the war. If what she was saying was true, someone was operating outside the law, and doing so with enough confidence to use tracking dogs to recover escapees. He moved to his pack, which lay discarded by the door, and began searching through its contents. Behind him, he heard the creak of the bed as Adsila rose to her feet. He turned to find her standing unsteadily, the knife still in her hand. "Rest," he advised. "You've lost blood." She ignored him, moving instead to his coat, which hung dripping by the door. Before he could stop her, she had reached into the pocket and withdrawn a folded piece of paper, her belongings, he realized, which he had taken from her before carrying her up the cliff. She unfolded the paper with one hand, keeping the knife ready in the other. It was a crude map drawn on what appeared to be a page torn from a ledger. Jedediah caught a glimpse of familiar terrain, the river, the ravine, and what might be his own cabin, marked with an X. "You were looking for this place?" he said, realization dawning. "You weren't running blindly. You were coming here." Adsila stared at him, caught between defiance and uncertainty. Behind her, lightning flashed again, illuminating the photograph on the shelf of the one that had triggered her fear earlier. Jedediah followed her gaze, then moved to the shelf and picked up the frame. "You know this man," he said, pointing to Colonel Blackburn. It wasn't a question. Her face hardened. "Bad man. He run camp." Jedediah stared at the photograph memories surfacing that he'd long tried to bury. Blackburn had been ruthless, even during the war, known for his efficient handling of enemy combatants and civilians alike. Jedediah had served under him for 2 years before requesting a transfer to another unit, a request granted only after he'd threatened to take certain observations to the high command. "Why did you come here?" he asked, setting the photograph face down on the shelf. Adsila's strength seemed to be failing her. She leaned against the wall, the map clutched in one hand, the knife lowered, but still present. "Man in camp say scout with mark on neck, help Adsila." She gestured to her own neck, then pointed at Jedediah, at the long scar that ran from just below his ear down to his collarbone, a souvenir from a Comanche blade years ago. "Scout," she said, using the Apache word tinza. It was what the natives had called men like him, trackers, advance forces, the eyes of the army. "Who told you this?" "Old soldier. Guard sometimes. He kind. Give water when others not look." She swallowed clearly, struggling to remain upright. "He say tinza, hate Blackburn. Help Apache before." Jedediah's jaw tightened. There had been incidents, moments when he'd intervened to prevent Blackburn's men from mistreating prisoners or civilians. Small acts of defiance that had ultimately led to his transfer request. But that had been years ago, and far from here. The fact that stories had spread that he was known by the mark on his neck was unsettling. "You need to rest," he said, changing the subject. "We can talk more later." This time she didn't argue. The knife slipped from her fingers as she slid down the wall, her energy spent. Jedediah moved forward quickly, catching her before she hit the floor. She felt fragile in his arms, all bone and sinew, as he carried her back to the bed. "Dogs will come," she murmured as he pulled the blanket over her. "Not in this storm," Jedediah replied. "Rest now." He watched as her eyes closed, her breathing gradually evening out. Only when he was certain she was asleep did he retrieve her knife from the floor and tuck it into his belt. Then he moved to the table and unfolded the map she had brought. It was crude but effective, showing the major landmarks between what he assumed was the labor camp and his cabin. The fact that someone had directed her here specifically, that someone knew where to find him, sent a chill through him that had nothing to do with his rain-soaked clothes. Jedediah changed into dry garments, moving quietly so as not to disturb Adsila. He needed to think, to plan. If Blackburn was operating an illegal mine using forced Apache labor, that was a federal crime, though whether anyone would care enough to investigate was another matter entirely. The territories were still wild justice, often administered by whoever had the most guns or the most money. Outside, the storm continued to rage. Jedediah stepped onto the porch, sheltered from the worst of the rain by the overhanging roof. Thunder stood patiently in the corral, steam rising from his rain-slicked back. The horse raised his head at Jedediah's appearance, nickering softly. "I know, boy," Jedediah said. "We've got ourselves in a fine mess." He scanned the tree line, the habit of vigilance too deeply ingrained to ignore. No sign of movement, no hounds baying in the distance. The rain would have washed away their trail, at least temporarily, but it wouldn't stop someone determined. And if Blackburn was involved, determination was a certainty. By midday, the storm had passed, leaving behind a saturated landscape and a sky of brilliant blue. Jedediah had spent the morning checking his supplies, cleaning his weapons, and occasionally glancing at the still sleeping form of Adsila. She had not stirred her body, claiming the rest it desperately needed. It was nearly sunset when she finally woke. Jedediah was seated at the table cleaning his rifle when he heard the change in her breathing. He looked up to find her watching him, her eyes clear and alert in a way they hadn't been before. "How long?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. "Most of the day," he replied, setting the rifle aside. "Are you hungry?" She nodded, pushing herself up to a sitting position with a wince. Jedediah moved to the stove, where a pot of stew had been simmering. He ladled a portion into a bowl and brought it to her, along with a spoon and a cup of water. She accepted them cautiously, as if expecting him to snatch them away at any moment. "Eat," he said, stepping back to give her space. "You need your strength." She did not need to be told twice. She ate with the focused intensity of someone who had known hunger, careful not to spill a drop. Jedediah returned to the table deliberately, giving his attention to the rifle rather than watching her eat. When she had finished, she set the bowl aside and spoke. "Why you help Adsila?" He considered the question, unsure of the answer himself. It seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him with those dark, penetrating eyes. Right thing cost much sometimes. "I'm aware," he said dryly. "You know Blackburn come for Adsila." It wasn't a question, but he nodded anyway. "Or probably, but not today. The storm will have washed away our trail, and they'll have to search a wide area." "Tomorrow, then," she said with grim certainty. "Maybe. Maybe not for several days. Depends on how badly he wants to find you." Her expression darkened. "He want Adsila know things, see things at camp." Jedediah's interest sharpened. "What things?" She hesitated, clearly weighing how much to trust him. "Weapons," she said finally. "Not just mine. Place where make guns. Many guns. Blackburn sell to both sides." "Both sides of what?" "Army and some tribes. Those who fight army." She looked down at her hands. "Blackburn want war. War mean money." Jedediah absorbed this information with growing unease. Selling weapons to hostile tribes was treason plain and simple. If Blackburn was arming both sides of the ongoing conflicts in the territories, he was profiting from blood American and Native alike. "These are serious accusations," he said carefully. "Adsila not lie," she replied, her chin lifting in defiance. "I didn't say you were. But Blackburn was a respected officer. People will need more than the word of an escaped prisoner to believe this." "You believe," she challenged. Jedediah thought of the man he had known during the war, capable, ruthless, pragmatic to a fault. The kind of officer who saw casualties as numbers rather than men. Yes, he could believe it. "I think you're telling the truth as you know it," he said cautiously. Her expression hardened slightly at the qualification. She reached for the chain still wrapped around her waist, which he had been unable to remove without the proper tools. "Truth has marks," she said, lifting the fabric of her dress to reveal her lower back. Jedediah had seen many horrors during the war, but the sight still made his stomach clench. Her skin was a map of abuse, long thin scars from whippings, burns from what might have been cigars, and most damning of all, a brand. The mark was distinctive, a stylized B, enclosed in a circle, Blackburn's mark. "You do this," she said, letting the dress fall back into place. "To all women in camp." Jedediah turned away, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. The use of branding was a practice reserved for cattle and horses, not people. That any man, let alone a former officer of the United States Army, would mark human beings in such a way spoke to a level of depravity that defied comprehension. "I believe you," he said, his voice rough with suppressed anger. Adsila watched him, gauging his reaction. Whatever she saw seemed to satisfy her because she nodded once and then changed the subject. "Chain," she said, gesturing to the metal still wrapped around her waist. "Can remove." Jedediah welcomed the distraction. "I'll need tools from the barn. Wait here." Outside, the air was fresh and clean after the storm. The last rays of sunset painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson. Jedediah stood on the porch for a moment, drawing deep breaths to calm the rage that had built within him. The war had changed. Many men hardened them in ways that civilian life couldn't understand. But there was a difference between hardness and cruelty, between pragmatism and sadism. He retrieved the necessary tools from the barn, a hammer, chisel, and metal file, then paused to check on Thunder. The horse seemed recovered from the night's exertions, grazing contentedly in the corral. Jedediah patted his neck, taking comfort in the animal's solid presence. "We're going to have company soon," he told the horse. "Best be ready." Back in the cabin, he found Adsila examining the contents of his shelves, jars of preserved food books, ammunition, the everyday detritus of a solitary life. She turned as he entered, not embarrassed to have been caught snooping. "You live alone," she observed. "Yes, long time." Jedediah set the tools on the table. 3 years. Her gaze moved to his left hand, where the pale band of skin on his fourth finger told its own story. "Wife dead," he said curtly. "Fever took her and our son." She nodded, accepting the information without the usual platitudes or expressions of sympathy that he had come to dread. "Adsila, sorry," she said simply. He gestured to the chair. "Sit. I'll see what I can do about that chain." She sat watching closely as he examined the links wrapped around her waist. The chain was secured with a padlock, which would have been simple enough to open with the right key. Without it, he would need to cut through one of the links. "This might take a while," he warned, positioning the chisel against one of the links. "Try to hold still." Adsila remained motionless as he worked the only sign of discomfort, a slight tightening around her eyes, when the chisel slipped and scraped against her skin. It took nearly an hour of painstaking effort before the link finally gave way, the chain falling loose around her. "There," Jedediah said, setting the tools aside. "You're free of it." She gathered the length of chain in her hands, staring at it with an expression he couldn't read. Then, with sudden violence, she flung it into the corner of the cabin. "Not free," she said, her voice low and intense. "Not while others still wear chains. Not while Blackburn live." Jedediah understood the sentiment all too well. Freedom wasn't just the absence of physical restraint. It was the knowledge that you couldn't be put back in chains, that the threat was gone. For Adsila, that meant Blackburn's death or imprisonment. "What's your plan?" he asked. "You came here looking for me. Now you found me. What did you expect?" She met his gaze directly. "Help. You know land. Know how Blackburn think. Help free others." The request was as audacious as it was dangerous. One man against what sounded like a well-guarded compound run by a former military officer who wouldn't hesitate to kill. The odds were not favorable. "That's a tall order," Jedediah said, rubbing a hand across his jaw. "How many guards at this camp?" 10, maybe 12, she replied. "Some leave, new ones come, always changing." "And prisoners?" A 30, maybe more, mostly Apache, some Navajo, few white men who ask questions. Jedediah frowned at this last detail. White prisoners who... Adsila shrugged. Men in suits come to see mine. Ask about papers. Blackburn not like questions. They not leave. Government inspectors, most likely. If Blackburn was operating outside the law, he couldn't afford to let officials report back on what they'd seen. The disappearance of federal agents would eventually draw attention, but in the vast territories, such investigations could take months or years. Where exactly is this camp? Jedediah asked, reaching for the map she had brought. Adsila pointed to a location in the mountains, about 20 miles northwest of the cabin. Here, hidden in trees, guards on hills. Jedediah studied the map, his mind automatically calculating routes, sight lines, potential approaches. The tactical part of his brain, the part trained through years of scouting, was already engaged with the problem. But the rational part knew that this was no mere reconnaissance mission. This was potentially suicide. "I need to think about this," he said finally. "It's not a simple matter." Disappointment flashed across Adsila's face, quickly replaced by determination. "Adsila, go alone then. With a wounded shoulder and no weapons, you wouldn't make it halfway there before Blackburn's men found you." Adsila must try. Others suffer. Jedediah ran a hand through his hair, frustrated by her stubbornness, yet understanding it all too well. "Give me until morning," he said. "I need to consider all the angles. If we're going to do this, we do it smart, not rushed." She studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Until morning." Night fell fully, the cabin growing dark, except for the glow from the wood stove. Jedediah lit a lamp and placed it on the table, then began preparing a simple meal. Adsila watched him work, her gaze following his movements with the weariness of a wild creature. "You can take the bed," he said as he set plates on the table. "I'll sleep by the fire." She didn't respond immediately, her attention caught by something on the shelf beside the photograph he had turned face down earlier. She rose and moved to it, picking up a small carved wooden horse. "Your son make?" she asked. Jedediah glanced up, something tightening in his chest at the sight of the toy in her hands. "Yes, Samuel. He was 8. Adsila handled the carving with surprising gentleness, running her fingers over the rough-hewn features. "He good with hands." He was. Jedediah agreed, the simple past tense a reminder of all that had been lost. She replaced the horse carefully, exactly as she had found it, then turned to face him. "You lose family. Adsila lose family too. Father killed by soldiers. Mother die in camp. Brother..." She hesitated. "Brother still in camp if alive." Jedediah understood then the true driving force behind her determination. Not just freedom for herself, but for the brother she wasn't certain had survived. "What's his name?" he asked quietly. "Aote." She replied, the name spoken with such tenderness that it required no translation. "Beloved." The meal passed in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Afterward, Jedediah checked Adsila's wound, relieved to find no signs of infection. He reapplied the bandage, careful to maintain a professional distance despite their proximity. As he worked, a thought occurred to him. "How did you know I was here?" he asked. "The map shows my cabin. But how did you know this was where to find me?" Adsila's expression grew guarded. "Guard tell, say Tinza with Mark live here. Say he helped before. This guard, he gave you the map." She nodded. "He old, not like others. Say he served with you before." Jedediah tried to think of who it might be, someone who had been in his unit, who knew where he had settled after leaving the army. Not many possibilities came to mind. He had kept to himself even during his service, and few had bothered to stay in touch afterward. Did he give you a name? Matthews, she said after a moment's thought. Old man with beard. The name struck a chord. Corporal Thomas Matthews, an older soldier who had served as a quartermaster in Jedediah's unit. Quiet, efficient, generally decent to the native scouts they had employed. Jedediah had assumed the man had mustered out years ago, perhaps returned to whatever family he had back east. I remember him, Jedediah said. Didn't know he was still in service. Not service, Adsila corrected. Work for Blackburn, private. That made more sense. Blackburn had always cultivated loyal followers, men who would follow him into any venture, legal or otherwise. If he was operating a private mining operation, he would need trusted individuals to oversee it. Matthews helped you escape? Jedediah asked, finding it hard to reconcile the by-the-book quartermaster with someone who would aid a prisoner. Adsila shook her head. Not help escape. Just say where to go after. Give map when no one look. She touched her bandaged shoulder. Guard who do this catch Adsila leaving. Matthews not there. So the old soldier had provided information, but not direct assistance. It was still a risk, one that could cost him his life if Blackburn discovered it. The question was why direct Adsila specifically to Jedediah? And why now? When did Matthews give you this information? He asked. 2 days ago, she replied. He say go now. Say something bad coming. Jedediah's unease deepened. Did he say what? New weapons, Adsila said. Big shipment. After that, no more camp. All prisoners. She drew a finger across her throat in a universal gesture. A cleanup operation. Once the weapons were delivered, the mine would have served its purpose, and witnesses would become liabilities. It was cold, calculating, and entirely in character for the Blackburn that Jedediah remembered. When is this shipment due? 3 days, Adsila said gravely, maybe 4. Which meant they had very little time. If they were going to act, it would need to be soon. Get some rest, Jedediah said, rising from the table. We'll leave at first light. Surprise flashed across Adsila's face. You help? I'll help. He confirmed his decision made. But we do this my way. No rushing in. We scout first. Understand the layout, and then make a plan. Relief softened her features, making her look younger, more vulnerable. Adsila, thank you. Jedediah shook his head. Don't thank me yet. This could still get us both killed. He made a pallet for himself near the wood stove, using spare blankets and his saddle as a pillow. Adsila took the bed reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable with the arrangement, but too exhausted to argue. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Jedediah lay awake longer, staring at the darkened ceiling, his mind turning over the complications of what he had agreed to do. Blackburn was dangerous, not just because of his position or resources, but because of his mind. He was tactically brilliant, morally flexible, and utterly ruthless. Going against him would require every skill Jedediah had developed during the war, and likely some luck besides. Eventually he too drifted into an uneasy sleep, haunted by dreams of chains and fire and the faces of men he had killed. In one such dream, he was back on the battlefield, smoke obscuring his vision as he searched desperately for something or someone. A child's voice called his name again and again, but he couldn't locate the source. Then the smoke cleared momentarily, revealing Samuel standing in the middle of the field, his small body silhouetted against flames. Jedediah jolted awake, a shout dying in his throat. The cabin was dark, the fire in the wood stove reduced to embers. He lay still, his heart hammering in his chest, sweat cooling on his skin despite the chill in the air. A soft sound drew his attention to the bed where Adsila sat watching him, her expression unreadable in the dim light. "Bad dreams," she observed quietly. Jedediah didn't bother to deny it. "Old ghosts." She nodded as if this was expected. Spirits not rest when work not done. The statement was so close to his own thoughts that it unsettled him. "What work?" he asked. "Each spirit know," she replied. "Some seek justice, some seek peace, some seek to protect those left behind." She tilted her head slightly. "What your spirit seek, Tinza?" It was a question he had asked himself many times in the dark hours of the night. What would bring him peace? What would allow the ghosts to rest? He had no answer, not really. Only the vague sense that he was waiting for something, some sign or purpose that had yet to reveal itself. "I don't know," he admitted. Adsila seemed to accept this. She rose from the bed and moved to the wood stove, adding several small logs from the nearby pile. The fire caught quickly, orange light spilling across the floor as she worked. "Spirit know," she said, returning to the bed. "Even when mine not know. Listen when spirits speak." Jedediah watched as she settled back under the blanket, her silhouette sharp against the wall in the renewed firelight. There was something otherworldly about her in that moment, something that spoke of different ways of understanding the world of knowledge that ran deeper than what could be expressed in words. He closed his eyes, not expecting to sleep again, but needing the darkness. Behind his eyelids, he saw the battlefield again, but this time without the panic of the dream. He saw the choices he had made, the men he had killed, and those he had saved. He saw Blackburn ordering the execution of Apache prisoners and himself standing aside, not participating, but not preventing it either. Perhaps that was the work his spirit sought. Not just to right a specific wrong, but to stop standing aside. To act rather than observe. To choose a side in a conflict he had tried to avoid since leaving the army. Dawn was still hours away, but Jedediah knew sleep would not return. He rose quietly and moved to the table where he spread out the map Adsila had brought. By the light of the stove, he began to plan, his mind clear and focused for the first time in years. Outside, the night was still, the storm long past. Stars wheeled overhead, bright and cold in the vast darkness. In the corral, Thunder raised his head, sensing the change in his master's resolve. And somewhere to the northwest, in a hidden camp in the mountains, prisoners waited in chains, not knowing that their fate now rested in the hands of a former scout with a scar on his neck and a woman with the courage to escape. The wheels of change had been set in motion, and there would be no turning back. First light crept over the eastern ridge, painting the world in shades of gray and gold. Jedediah stood on the porch, a steaming cup of coffee in one hand, watching as the shadows retreated across the clearing. He had been up for hours preparing supplies, checking weapons, studying the map, until its details were committed to memory. Behind him, the cabin door opened. Adsila stepped out, her movement still favoring her injured shoulder, but more fluid than the day before. She had washed her face and rebraided her hair, and had somehow managed to repair the worst tears in her deerskin dress, using scraps of leather and thread she'd found in the cabin. "Morning," Jedediah said, offering her the cup. She accepted it, taking a small sip before handing it back. "You plan?" He nodded toward the corral, where Thunder was already saddled, saddlebags bulging with supplies. A second smaller horse, a sturdy bay mare he kept for pack trips, was similarly equipped. "We ride to within a few miles of the camp, then approach on foot," he explained. "No direct confrontation yet. First, we observe. Learn the routines the guard changes where they keep the prisoners." Adsila followed his gaze to the horses. "Then what?" "Then we find a way to get your brother and the others out with minimal bloodshed." She looked skeptical. "Blackburn not let prisoners go. Must be blood." "Maybe," Jedediah conceded. "But killing should be the last resort, not the first." She studied him with those penetrating dark eyes. "You fear killing." "I fear what it does to the killer," he replied honestly. "I've seen too many men lose pieces of themselves with each life they take. Eventually, there's nothing left but the killing." Something in his words seemed to reach her. She nodded slowly, a new understanding in her expression. "You've seen much death, Tinsa." "More than my share," he admitted. "Ready to ride?" They set out as the sun cleared the horizon, following a narrow trail that wound through the pines before joining a wider track heading northwest. Jedediah rode slightly ahead, his senses alert for any sign of pursuit or danger. Adsila followed on the bay mare, adapting quickly to the horse's gait despite her injury. They rode in silence for the most part, each lost in their own thoughts. The forest was alive with morning sounds, birds calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, the steady rhythm of hooves on packed earth. It was peaceful in a way that belied their purpose. Around midday, they stopped to rest the horses by a small stream. Jedediah shared some jerky and hardtack from his saddlebags, watching as Adsila moved to the water's edge and knelt, cupping her hands to drink. "Your shoulder holding up?" he asked. She flexed it experimentally. "Better. Adsila, heal quick." "Good. We've got another 4 hours of riding before we need to leave the horses." She rose, wiping her hands on her dress. "You know this land well." "I've hunted these mountains for years," Jedediah said. "Not many trails that I haven't followed at some point. And Blackburn know this." The question was perceptive, touching on something that had been nagging at Jedediah's mind since the previous night. "Probably," he admitted. "He always kept track of his men even after they left his service." Adsila's brow furrowed. "Then he know you help Adsila." "If he's figured out where you went, yes." She considered this, her expression troubled. "Maybe trap," she suggested. "Maybe Matthews send Adsila to you so Blackburn find both." It was a possibility that Jedediah had already considered. The timing was certainly suspicious, an escaped prisoner showing up at his cabin just as Blackburn was allegedly preparing to eliminate witnesses to his operation. It could be coincidence, or it could be something more calculated. "Maybe," he acknowledged. "But if it's a trap, it's poorly laid. They haven't followed us yet, and the longer they wait, the more prepared we'll be." Adsila didn't look convinced. Blackburn clever, not make simple trap. She was right, of course. Blackburn had always been several steps ahead of his opponents, anticipating their moves with uncanny precision. If he was setting a trap, it would be subtle, multifaceted, designed to close when least expected. "We'll be careful," Jedediah promised. "Keep our eyes open for anything unusual." They continued their journey, the terrain gradually becoming more rugged as they approached the foothills of the mountains. The trail narrowed, forcing them to ride single file through dense stands of pine and across rocky outcroppings. By late afternoon, they had reached the point where they would need to proceed on foot. Jedediah selected a small clearing sheltered by a natural rock formation well off the main trail, and difficult to spot unless you knew exactly where to look. They unsaddled the horses and secured them with enough lead rope to graze, but not enough to wander far. "We'll travel light from here." Jedediah said, transferring essential supplies to a small pack. Weapons, water, some food. Leave everything else. Adsila watched as he checked his rifle, a Winchester repeater that had seen better days, but was meticulously maintained. He also carried a Colt revolver on his hip and a hunting knife in his boot. From one of the saddlebags, he produced a second knife, smaller than his own, but well-balanced, and offered it to her. "I believe this is yours," he said. She accepted it with a nod of thanks, securing it in a hidden sheath within the folds of her dress. The practiced movement told him this was not the first time she had carried a concealed weapon. "I camp still 3 miles," she said, gesturing toward the mountains rising before them. "Guards on ridge there and there." She pointed to 2 elevated positions with clear sight lines down the approaching valleys. Jedediah nodded, already identifying the likely patrol routes and blind spots. "We'll circle around to the east," he decided. "Approach from above rather than below. Less chance of being spotted that way." The climb was arduous, made more difficult by the need for silence and the care to leave minimal signs of their passage. Jedediah moved with the quiet efficiency of a man long accustomed to traversing wilderness, unseen, choosing their path to maximize cover and minimize exposure. Adsila followed her movements, almost as stealthy as his own, despite her injury. The sun was low in the western sky by the time they reached a position overlooking the camp. Concealed among a cluster of boulders and stunted pines, they had a clear view of the operation below. The camp was larger than Jedediah had expected, occupying a small plateau halfway up the mountainside. A central clearing contained several sturdy wooden buildings, likely offices and quarters for the guards. To one side, a series of low windowless structures could only be the prisoner barracks. The entrance to the mine itself was visible as a dark gash in the mountain face, with rails leading out to a sorting area where piles of ore awaited processing. Armed men patrolled the perimeter, their movements suggesting military training rather than the haphazard vigilance of civilian guards. Jedediah counted 8 visible sentries, but suspected there were more inside the buildings or positioned at other vantage points. "There," Adsila whispered, pointing to a separate structure set apart from the others. Unlike the rough-hewn buildings of the main camp, this one was larger, more solidly constructed with a proper door and what appeared to be glass windows. Blackburn House. Jedediah studied it through his field glass. The building had the look of a permanent residence rather than a temporary camp structure. Blackburn was clearly planning to be here for some time. "Where do they keep the prisoners at night?" he asked, scanning the compound. Adsila pointed to the row of low buildings. "There. Men and women separate, chained to wall inside." "And your brother? Which building?" Her expression clouded. "Not know for certain. Men's building, most likely. But Aote special prisoner. Maybe different place." "Special how?" "He let escape before." She explained, a hint of pride in her voice. 3 prisoners get away. Blackburn catch them but not break Aote. Put him in box sometimes." "Box?" She indicated with her hands, a space barely large enough for a man to sit hunched over. "Hot in day, cold at night. No food, little water." Jedediah's jaw tightened. He had heard of such punishment boxes being used in some prison camps during the war, a form of torture that often resulted in death from exposure or dehydration. "When did you last see him?" he asked. 4 days ago, she replied, before escape. So they didn't even know if Aote was still alive. The reality of what they were attempting began to settle more heavily on Jedediah's shoulders. They were 2 people against a fortified camp with at least 8 armed guards, attempting to locate and free dozens of prisoners, one of whom might already be dead. "We need more information," he said, lowering the field glass. "And we need a better plan than just walking in there." Adsila's gaze remained fixed on the camp below. Matthew's help, maybe? Maybe. Jedediah agreed, though he was reluctant to place too much trust in a man whose loyalties were unclear. But first, we need to observe the routines. Guard changes mealtimes when they bring the prisoners in from the mine. They settled in to watch as the camp transitioned from day to evening operations. As the sun set, lamps were lit in the buildings, casting pools of yellow light across the clearing. Prisoners were indeed led from the mine entrance to the low buildings Adsila had identified, shuffling in lines with the dull clink of chains accompanying their movement. Even from a distance, Jedediah could see that they were in poor condition, thin, stooped, moving with the careful slowness of those conserving what little strength remained. Men, women, and even some older children, mostly Apache from their dress and appearance, though he noted a few who might be Navajo or other tribes. And then, separate from the main groups, a smaller contingent was led toward a structure he hadn't noticed before, a kind of pen or cage adjacent to Blackburn's house. 3 figures were roughly pushed inside the door, secured with a heavy padlock. There. Adsila breathed, her body tensing beside him. Middle one, Ioti. Jedediah focused the field glass on the indicated figure. Even in the fading light, he could make out a tall, lean man with the same proud carriage as Adsila, despite his obvious mistreatment. His face bore the marks of recent beatings, one eye swollen shut, but he walked without assistance, his back straight. He's alive, Jedediah confirmed, hearing Adsila's soft exhale of relief. Other 2, she asked. He adjusted the glass. One looks like an Apache as well, older man. The third... He hesitated, surprised. The third is white, wearing what's left of a suit. Adsila nodded. Government man. Come ask questions. Now, prisoner. A federal agent, most likely someone who had come to investigate rumors of an illegal operation and found more than he bargained for. If they could free him along with the others, it would add legitimacy to any accusations they might later bring against Blackburn. As darkness settled fully over the mountain, the camp fell into its nighttime rhythm. Guards changed shifts, moving in pairs along established routes with predictable timing. A small group gathered around a fire near the central buildings, passing a bottle and engaging in low conversation. From the barracks came no sound or movement, suggesting the prisoners were either asleep or too beaten down to attempt any nighttime rebellion. We should go back to the horses, Jedediah said finally. Return tomorrow night when we have a full plan. Adsila looked reluctant to leave her gaze still fixed on the cage where her brother was imprisoned, but she nodded, recognizing the wisdom of patience. They retreated carefully, taking a different route down the mountain to avoid creating an obvious trail. The descent in darkness was treacherous, requiring them to move slowly and often feel their way along steep sections. It was well past midnight when they finally reached the clearing where they had left the horses. Both animals were alert, ears pricked forward at their approach. Thunder gave a soft whicker of recognition as Jedediah drew near, but there was a tension in the horse's posture that immediately put him on guard. Something's wrong, he murmured, drawing his revolver. Adsila froze beside him, her hand moving to the knife hidden in her dress. Someone here. Jedediah scanned the clearing, eyes straining in the darkness. Nothing moved. No sound betrayed an intruder's presence. Yet the horses remained uneasy, Thunder particularly so. Maybe just a predator passed through, Jedediah said, though he didn't holster his weapon. Mountain lion or bear. They approached the horses, cautiously checking them for any signs of injury or distress. Finding none, Jedediah began to relax slightly, until Adsila suddenly gripped his arm, pointing to something on Thunder's saddle. A folded piece of paper had been tucked beneath the pommel, secured with a strip of raw hide. Jedediah removed it carefully, aware that they were dealing with someone skilled enough to approach 2 tethered horses without spooking them. What'd it say? Adsila asked, peering over his shoulder as he unfolded the paper. The message was brief, written in a shaky but legible hand. Thornton, they know you're here. Trap set for dawn. Go east, not west. We'll find you if I can. Matthews, Jedediah said, refolding the paper and tucking it into his shirt. Warning us. Adsila's expression was a mixture of relief and concern. He not betray Adsila then? Apparently not. But we need to move. Now. If Blackburn's men are planning an ambush at dawn, we don't want to be anywhere near this spot. They quickly saddled the horses, working by touch in the darkness. Within minutes, they were mounted and moving Jedediah, leading them east as the note had instructed, away from the camp rather than toward it. Why we go away? Adsila asked, her voice low with urgency. Iote's still there. Because walking into a trap won't help him, Jedediah replied. We need to regroup, figure out what Blackburn knows and how to counter it. They rode through the remainder of the night, following game trails and dry creek beds to minimize their tracks. The terrain grew increasingly rough, forcing them to dismount and lead the horses through particularly difficult sections. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, they had put several miles between themselves and the clearing where they had received the warning. Jedediah selected a defensible position, a small depression surrounded by boulders that offered both concealment and a clear view of the approaches. They settled the horses in the center where they would be hidden from casual observation. Rest, he told Adsila, noting the exhaustion evident in the slump of her shoulders. I'll keep watch. She nodded, too tired to argue, and curled up on a patch of relatively soft ground. Within minutes, her breathing had deepened into sleep. Jedediah positioned himself among the rocks, rifle across his knees, and surveyed their back trail. No sign of pursuit yet, but that didn't mean they weren't being followed. Blackburn's men would be skilled trackers familiar with the terrain. The rain had long since stopped helping to obscure their trail. As the sun rose, fully painting the landscape in vivid detail, Jedediah allowed himself to consider the implications of Matthew's warning. The old quartermaster had taken a significant risk to alert them, which suggested his sympathies lay more with the prisoners than with Blackburn. But why the specific instruction to head east? What lay in that direction that might be of use to them? The morning passed slowly, the sun climbing higher in a cloudless sky. Heat radiated from the rocks around them, and the horses grew restless in the confines of their shelter. Still no sign of pursuit. Around midday, Adsila stirred, sitting up and instantly alert despite her few hours of sleep. She joined Jedediah at his observation post, her dark eyes scanning the terrain with practiced efficiency. No one follow, she observed. Not yet. Jedediah agreed. Either they lost our trail or they're being more cautious than I expected. She considered this, or trapped somewhere else. It was a possibility he couldn't dismiss. If Blackburn knew these mountains as well as Jedediah did, and there was no reason to think otherwise, he might have anticipated their escape route and positioned men accordingly. We'll move again soon, he decided. Continue east until we find whatever Matthews was directing us toward. Adsila tilted her head slightly. You trust this Matthews? Not entirely, Jedediah admitted. But he helped you escape and he warned us about the ambush. For now, that's enough. They shared a meager meal of jerky and dried fruit, conserving their limited supplies. Jedediah checked and rechecked his weapons, a habit born of years in hostile territory. Adsila watched him with interest, noting the methodical way he handled each piece. You teach Adsila to shoot? She asked suddenly. He glanced up, surprised by the request. You don't know how... She shook her head. Apache women not allowed guns in reservation. Then in camp, no chance. Jedediah considered her request. A second gun hand could make the difference if they ended up in a confrontation with Blackburn's men, and she had a right to defend herself. All right, he agreed. But not here. Too much noise would give away our position. When we find a safer spot. She nodded, satisfied with the promise. They lapsed into silence again, and the only sounds the occasional stamp of a hoof from the horses and the cry of a hawk circling overhead. As the afternoon wore on, Jedediah's unease grew. The lack of pursuit was beginning to feel less like good fortune and more like part of a larger strategy. Blackburn had been a master of psychological warfare during his military service, known for letting enemies believe they had escaped, only to close the trap when their guard was down. "We need to move," he said, finally rising from his position. "Something doesn't feel right." They saddled the horses quickly and continued eastward, keeping to the high ground where they could maintain visibility of the surrounding terrain. The landscape gradually changed the rocky outcroppings, giving way to more densely forested slopes. The cover was welcome, but it also limited their ability to spot potential threats. Late in the day, they crested a ridge and paused, surveying the valley that opened before them. Unlike the barren slopes surrounding Blackburn's camp, this area was lush with vegetation, a small stream winding through its center. And there, nestled against the far slope, was a cabin similar in size to Jedediah's own, but clearly long abandoned, its roof partially collapsed and its door hanging askew. "That might be what Matthews meant for us to find," Jedediah said, studying the structure through his field glass. "Old trapper's cabin. Looks like no one's been there in years." Adsila frowned. "Why Matthews send us to empty cabin?" "I don't know. But it's the only man-made structure we've seen since heading east." He lowered the glass. "We'll approach carefully. Could be another trap." They descended into the valley, alert for any sign of ambush. The cabin stood silent and apparently deserted. No smoke from the chimney, no tracks around its perimeter. Still, Jedediah insisted on circling the structure completely before approaching the entrance, checking for any signs of recent visitation. Finding none, he drew his revolver and pushed open the damaged door, wincing at the creak of rusted hinges. The interior was dim dust motes, dancing in the shafts of light that penetrated through holes in the roof. A table lay overturned in one corner, a rusted stove stood against the far wall, and the remains of a bed frame occupied another corner. The floor was littered with debris, broken crockery, animal droppings, a tattered blanket. "No one here," Adsila observed, stepping in behind him. "Not recently, anyway." Jedediah agreed, holstering his weapon. "I don't understand why Matthews would direct us here." Adsila moved further into the cabin, examining the debris with curious eyes. Maybe leave something for us. It was possible. Jedediah began a more thorough search, checking the intact shelves, looking beneath the overturned furniture. Adsila joined him, her smaller hands probing crevices he might have missed. It was she who found a small metal box, wedged behind the rusted stove, nearly invisible in the accumulated dust and debris. She pulled it free and held it up, triumph in her expression. "Here. Something." Jedediah took the box, noting its solid construction and the small padlock securing its lid. The lock was new, incongruous against the aged metal of the container. He examined it briefly before drawing his knife and inserting the tip into the mechanism. With a practiced twist, the lock sprang open. Inside lay several items, a folded map newer and more detailed than the one Adsila had brought, a small key likely to the cage where Iote was being held, a letter addressed to Jedediah, and most surprisingly, a badge the kind carried by federal marshals. Jedediah opened the letter first, recognizing Matthew's handwriting from the earlier warning. Thornton, if you're reading this, you followed my directions and avoided Blackburn's trap. He knows the Apache woman came to you, and he's convinced you're planning to expose his operation. He's right, of course. What you don't know is that I've been working with the federal authorities for months, gathering evidence against Blackburn. The man in the cage with the Apache prisoner is Marshal James Collins, sent to investigate reports of illegal weapons manufacturing. Blackburn captured him before he could report back. The enclosed badge belongs to Collins. If anything happens to him, you'll need it to prove the legitimacy of any evidence you gather. The map shows all access points to the camp, including a hidden tunnel that leads directly to the weapons storage. The key will open the cage. Blackburn plans to move the weapons 3 nights from now, April 18th. After that, he'll eliminate all witnesses, myself included. I'll do what I can from inside, but you'll need to move quickly. God help us all. Thomas Matthews. Jedediah read the letter twice, then handed it to Adsila. Seems your Matthews is a federal informant. She scanned the letter, her brow furrowing as she worked through the English. He's spy on Blackburn. Apparently. And he's given us the means to get into the camp undetected. Jedediah unfolded the map, studying the detailed renderings of the compound and its surroundings. Sure enough, it showed a narrow tunnel leading from a hidden entrance on the eastern slope directly to a building labeled Arsenal. This changes things, he said, thinking rapidly. If we can get to this Marshal Collins and free him along with Iote, we'll have federal authority behind us. That means we can legally shut down Blackburn's operation and have him arrested. Adsila looked skeptical. Blackburn not surrender. He kill first. Probably, Jedediah acknowledged. But with a federal marshal involved, we'll have reinforcements. Collins must have told someone where he was going before he disappeared. He checked the date on Matthew's letter, April 15th. Today was the 17th. That meant Blackburn planned to move the weapons tomorrow night, after which the prisoners would be eliminated. How do we need to move tonight? Jedediah decided. Use the tunnel to get into the camp, free Collins and Iote, then the rest of the prisoners. Adsila studied the map, her finger tracing the route of the tunnel. Many guards, many prisoners, just 2 of us. 3 if Matthews helps, and the element of surprise counts for a lot. Jedediah folded the map and tucked it into his shirt along with the key and badge. We'll rest here until dusk, then head back toward the camp. They secured the horses in a small corral behind the cabin, where grass and a tiny spring provided adequate sustenance. Inside, they cleared enough debris to make a relatively comfortable resting place on the floor. Jedediah took the opportunity to check Adsila's wound again, pleased to find it healing well with no signs of infection. As he rewrapped the bandage, Adsila watched him with thoughtful eyes. Why you really help? She asked suddenly. Not just because Matthew's letter. You decide before. Jedediah finished securing the bandage before answering. I told you. It seemed like the right thing to do. No, she said, shaking her head. More than that, personal. He sighed, recognizing that she deserved a more honest answer. Blackburn and I have history, he admitted. During the war, I served under him for 2 years. I saw things, did things I'm not proud of. When I finally requested a transfer, he made sure I understood the cost of crossing him. What cost? Adsila prompted when he fell silent. Jedediah's jaw tightened at the memory. My wife and son died of fever 3 years ago. At least that's what I was told. But the timing was convenient. They fell ill just after I testified against Blackburn in a military inquiry regarding his treatment of prisoners. Understanding dawned in Adsila's eyes. You think Blackburn killed them? I don't know, Jedediah said honestly. There was a fever going through the valley. Many died. But Rebecca and Samuel had been healthy, and they were gone so quickly. He shook his head. I've never had proof. Just suspicion. Blackburn cruel enough, Adsila said softly. Punish enemies through family. Jedediah nodded, the old pain resurfacing despite his efforts to keep it buried. After they died, I left the settlement, built my cabin far from anyone else. Tried to forget. But some things don't stay forgotten. Adsila reached out hesitantly, her fingers lightly touching the scar on his neck. This from war. A Comanche raid, he replied. I was scouting ahead of the main column. They ambushed me, left me for dead. Blackburn's men found me the next day, still breathing somehow. Strong spirit, she observed, withdrawing her hand. Not ready to cross over? The phrase reminded him of something she had said during the night when he had woken from his nightmare. You said spirits don't rest when their work isn't done. What did you mean? Adsila was quiet for a moment, organizing her thoughts, or perhaps searching for the English words. Apache believe death not end, she said finally. Spirit continue journey. But some spirits cannot travel to next world until finished business in this one. Justice, revenge, protection. Each spirit know what keep it tied to earth. And how does the spirit find peace? Jedediah asked. Complete unfinished work, she replied simply. Or find someone to complete it for them. The implication hung in the air between them. Were the nightmares that had plagued him since the deaths of his wife and son more than just grief and guilt? Were they somehow a call to action from spirits unable to rest? Jedediah wasn't sure he believed in such things, but he couldn't deny the sense of purpose that had settled over him since agreeing to help Adsila. For the first time in years, the fog of grief and aimlessness had lifted, replaced by a clarity of vision and intent that felt almost like coming home. What about you? He asked, turning the conversation away from himself. What unfinished business drives you? Family, she answered without hesitation. Father died protecting children from soldiers. Mother died in camp sick from bad water. Ioti all Adsila have left. Must free him. And after, if we succeed? She seemed surprised by the question, as if she hadn't considered a future beyond the immediate goal. Not know, she admitted. Maybe return to mountains where Apache's still free. Maybe. She trailed off, looking around the abandoned cabin with a thoughtful expression. Maybe find place like this. Make new home. The simplicity of her aspiration touched something in Jedediah. How long had it been since he had allowed himself to think of the future as anything but an extension of his solitary present? This valley would be a good place for a home, he said, surprising himself with the words. Good water sheltered fertile soil. Adsila nodded, a small smile touching her lips. Yes, good place for new beginning. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Jedediah cleared his throat, returning to more immediate concerns. You should rest. We have a long night ahead. She settled onto the cleared space on the floor, using her arm as a pillow. But instead of closing her eyes, she continued to watch him. You not rest too? She asked. Soon, he promised. I want to study the map a bit more. She seemed to accept this, her eyes finally drifting closed. Jedediah watched her for a moment, noting how different she looked in sleep. The fierce determination softened the weariness temporarily set aside. It was a reminder that beneath the survivor's exterior was a woman who had endured unimaginable hardship, yet still retained the capacity to imagine a future worth fighting for. He turned his attention to the map, memorizing the layout of the camp and the route of the tunnel. According to Matthew's notations, the hidden entrance was located in a small ravine about half a mile east of the main compound, close enough for convenient access, but far enough to avoid casual discovery. The tunnel itself appeared to be a remnant of earlier mining operations, perhaps abandoned when a richer vein was discovered elsewhere. It led directly to the arsenal where Blackburn stored not only the weapons manufactured on site, but also those stolen or acquired through illegal trades. If they could reach the arsenal undetected, they would be in a position to either destroy the weapons or use them to secure the release of the prisoners. Either way, it would mean confronting Blackburn eventually, a prospect that filled Jedediah with a cold resolve. He must have dozed off despite his intentions, because the next thing he knew, Adsila was gently shaking his shoulder. The light through the damaged roof had dimmed considerably, indicating that evening was approaching. "Time to go," she said softly. Jedediah stretched, working out the stiffness in his muscles. They gathered their limited supplies and checked the horses one last time before setting out on foot toward the camp. The journey would take several hours, putting them at the tunnel entrance well after dark, ideal for their purposes. As they made their way through the gathering darkness, Jedediah took the opportunity to fulfill his promise to teach Adsila to shoot. They paused in a small clearing far enough from the camp that the sound wouldn't carry, and he showed her how to handle his revolver. 6 shots. He explained, demonstrating how to load and cock the weapon. Aim for the center of the body, not the head or limbs. Less chance of missing that way. Adsila took the gun, her small hands adjusting to its weight and balance. She listened intently as he explained about recoil and the importance of a steady stance. "Try 1 shot," he suggested, pointing to a knot on a tree trunk about 15 feet away, just to get the feel of it. She raised the gun, her posture mirroring his instructions perfectly. Her fingers squeezed the trigger slowly, and when the shot came, she managed the recoil better than he had expected. The bullet struck the tree several inches from the knot. Not perfect, but respectable for a first attempt. Good. Jedediah praised, taking the gun back and reloading the spent chamber. "You're a natural." She accepted the compliment with a nod, though he could see she was pleased. "One more try." He handed the revolver back, and she took aim again. This time, her shot hit just to the left of the knot, a definite improvement. "That'll do," Jedediah said, returning the gun to his holster. "With any luck, you won't need to use it tonight. But if you do..." He patted the weapon at his hip, indicating she should take it when necessary. They continued toward the camp, where the terrain growing steeper and more challenging as they approached the mountains. The moon rose nearly full, casting enough light to navigate by once their eyes adjusted to the darkness. Jedediah moved with the silent efficiency that had made him a valuable scout during the war, choosing each step to minimize noise and disturbance. Adsila matched his caution, her moccasins making even less sound on the rocky ground. They reached the ravine marked on Matthew's map shortly before midnight. The entrance to the tunnel was well concealed behind a growth of scrub brush, visible only if you knew exactly where to look. Jedediah cleared away enough of the vegetation to allow passage, revealing a low opening barely large enough for a man to crawl through. "I'll go first," he whispered, unslinging his rifle and passing it to Adsila. "Follow when I signal it's clear." The tunnel was narrower than he had anticipated, forcing him to wriggle forward on his elbows and knees. The air was stale and thick with dust, making each breath an effort. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only a few minutes, the passage widened enough for him to stand, hunched over. He paused, allowing his eyes to adjust to the near-total darkness. A faint light was visible far ahead, presumably some kind of ventilation shaft, or perhaps the exit into the arsenal. He returned to the entrance and signaled for Adsilla to join him. She crawled through with more ease than he had her smaller frame better suited to the confined space. Together, they proceeded down the tunnel, moving slowly to avoid making noise that might alert any guards posted in the arsenal. The passage gradually widened and heightened until they were able to walk upright, side by side. The light ahead grew stronger, resolving into what appeared to be a trap door in the ceiling of the tunnel, with moonlight filtering through the cracks around its edges. Jedediah held up a hand, signaling Adsilla to stop. He listened intently, trying to detect any movement or voices above. Hearing nothing, he cautiously approached the trap door and pressed against it with one hand. It moved slightly, suggesting it wasn't locked or barred from above. He pushed harder, lifting it just enough to peek through the opening. They had indeed reached the arsenal, a large barn-like structure filled with wooden crates and racks of weapons. The room appeared to be empty of guards, at least for the moment. He lowered the trapdoor gently and turned to Adsilla. "We're in the right place," he whispered. "No guards visible, but they could be just outside. We need to be quick and quiet." She nodded, her expression resolute in the dim light. Jedediah checked his weapons one last time, then took a deep breath. They were committed now. Whatever happened next would determine not only their fate, but that of Aote and dozens of other prisoners. With a final glance at Adsilla, he pushed open the trap door and pulled himself up into the arsenal of Colonel Blackburn's secret camp. The arsenal was larger than it had appeared from below, stretching the length of what might once have been a barn. Moonlight filtered through small, high windows, casting silvery paths across rows of wooden crates and racks of rifles. The air hung heavy with the scent of gun oil and black powder. Jedediah pulled himself fully into the room, then reached down to help Adsilla up through the trap door. They closed it silently behind them, careful not to disturb the thin layer of dust that covered most of the floor. Anyone checking later would notice their footprints, but with luck, they would be long gone by then. "Stay close," Jedediah whispered, drawing his revolver. "We need to find that key Matthews mentioned." They moved carefully through the arsenal, examining the crates as they went. Most were stamped with military markings, suggesting they had been diverted from legitimate shipments. Others bore no markings at all, their contents a mystery. Near the far wall, a small desk stood partially hidden behind a stack of larger crates. Jedediah approached it cautiously, noting the papers scattered across its surface, and a lamp recently extinguished, judging by the lingering smell of oil. "Someone was here not long ago," he murmured, scanning the documents quickly. Shipping manifests mostly detailing weapons movements to various locations throughout the territories, and beneath them, a ledger. He opened it, revealing page after page of precise entries, dates, locations, names, amounts. It was a complete record of Blackburn's illegal arms trade, including transactions with both the Army and various tribal groups, incriminating evidence that would be invaluable to federal authorities. "This needs to come with us," he said, tucking the ledger into his shirt. Adsilla, meanwhile, had discovered something else, a small lockbox pushed to the back of the desk. She pointed to it wordlessly, her expression questioning. Jedediah examined the box. Unlike the one they had found in the abandoned cabin, this one had no padlock, only a simple latch. He opened it carefully, revealing several keys of different sizes, along with a small leather pouch. "The cage keys," he said, selecting one that matched the description Matthews had given. "And something else." He opened the pouch, tipping its contents into his palm. A collection of small objects spilled out: a woman's wedding ring, a tarnished silver watch, a carved bone pendant. Personal items most likely taken from prisoners upon their capture. Adsila's sharp intake of breath confirmed his suspicion. She reached for the pendant, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked it up. "Aote," she whispered. "Father make for him." Jedediah returned the other items to the pouch and handed it to her. "Take it. We'll return what we can to their owners." She nodded, securing the pouch in a hidden pocket of her dress. "How we reach Cage from here?" Jedediah consulted his mental map of the compound. "The arsenal is on the northern edge. The cage where they're keeping Aote is near Blackburn's house to the south. We'll need to cross the open yard." "Many guards," Adsila reminded him. "Yes, but they'll be watching the perimeter, not the interior. And it's late. Most will be at reduced alertness." He checked his pocket watch. Just past 1 in the morning. "We move now, free Aote and the marshal, then head for the prisoner barracks." They located the main door of the arsenal, a heavy wooden affair reinforced with iron bands. Jedediah eased it open just enough to peer outside. The compound lay quiet under the moonlight, a few lamps burning in the windows of what appeared to be the guards' quarters. 2 sentries were visible, one patrolling the eastern perimeter, the other stationed near the mine entrance. Neither was looking in their direction. "Now," Jedediah whispered, slipping through the door with Adsila close behind. They hugged the shadows, moving from building to building with the stealth of hunters. Twice they had to freeze as guards passed nearby, pressing themselves into darkness until the danger passed. The cage came into view, a crude structure of iron bars set into a wooden frame barely large enough for 3 men to stand in. Beside it, Blackburn's house loomed dark and silent. The 3 prisoners were huddled on the ground, apparently asleep. One of them, Aote, Jedediah assumed, was sitting upright against the bars, his head bowed, but his posture suggesting alertness rather than slumber. Jedediah signaled for Adsila to wait while he scouted the immediate area. Finding no guards in direct line of sight, he beckoned her forward. They approached the cage from the rear, where the shadows were deepest. As they drew near, Aote's head lifted slightly, his body tensing. He had sensed their approach, despite their caution. Jedediah raised a finger to his lips, then stepped into view. Aote's eyes widened, first in alarm, then in recognition, as Adsila moved to stand beside Jedediah. Brother and sister stared at each other through the bars, a silent communication passing between them that needed no words. Jedediah moved to the cage door, examining the lock. It was a simple padlock easily opened with the key they had taken from the arsenal. He inserted it carefully, wincing at the small click as the mechanism released. The sound was enough to rouse the other prisoners. The older Apache man stirred, then froze when he saw the newcomers. The white man, Marshal Collins, presumably reacted more dramatically, scrambling to his feet with a startled exclamation that Jedediah silenced with a sharp gesture. "The Federal Marshal Collins," Jedediah whispered. The man nodded, his expression wary beneath a week's growth of beard. "Who are you?" "Friend of Matthews. We're here to get you out." Jedediah swung the cage door open. "But we need to move quickly and quietly." Collins seemed to assess him for a moment, then nodded again. "Lead the way." Aote emerged from the cage like a shadow, moving with a silent grace. Despite his obvious injuries, he was taller than Adsila, with the same proud bearing and intense dark eyes. Those eyes fixed on Jedediah, now evaluating him with the same caution he might show a potentially dangerous animal. Adsila spoke rapidly in Apache, too low and fast for Jedediah to catch more than a word or two. Whatever she said seemed to satisfy Iote because he inclined his head slightly in what might have been acknowledgement or thanks. The older Apache man followed, moving more stiffly, but with the same care for silence. Collins came last, his city-bred movements noisy in comparison to the natives. The prisoner barracks are that way, Jedediah said, pointing toward the low buildings on the far side of the compound. But we need to be careful. Once we free the others, there's no way to keep it quiet. There's a storage shed near the barracks, Collins offered. Weapons confiscated from the prisoners when they were brought in. If we can arm them, they can help defend themselves. It was a good suggestion. Jedediah nodded. You and the older man head for the shed. Adsila, Iote, and I will start freeing the prisoners. We'll meet at the barracks. Collins hesitated. You have a plan for getting out of here. Blackburn has men all over these mountains. The tunnel we used to get in, Jedediah replied. It's narrow, but it will take us far enough from the camp to have a fighting chance. The marshal seemed about to say more, but a shout from the direction of the arsenal cut him short. A guard had discovered the open door and was raising the alarm. Go now, Jedediah ordered, pushing Collins and the older Apache toward the storage shed. We'll meet at the barracks. He turned to Adsila and Iote, both already moving toward the prisoner quarters. The element of surprise was lost, but they still had a chance if they moved quickly enough. Across the compound, guards were emerging from their quarters, rifles in hand. One spotted the open cage and shouted, pointing in their direction. A shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood just above Jedediah's head. He returned fire, not aiming to kill, but to force the guard to take cover. It worked, buying them precious seconds to reach the first of the barracks buildings. The door was secured with a heavy bar, from the outside, designed to keep prisoners and not intruders out. Jedediah lifted it away, and Iote pushed the door open. Inside, the stench of unwashed bodies and despair was overwhelming. Prisoners lay chained to rings set into the walls, men of all ages, their conditions ranging from merely malnourished to critically ill. They stirred at the intrusion, fear giving way to confusion, and then cautious hope as they recognized Aoti among the newcomers. Jedediah handed the keys to Adsila. Free as many as can walk on their own. We don't have time for the others. It was a harsh reality, but one they all understood. Adsila and Iote moved quickly from prisoner to prisoner, unlocking chains and helping men to their feet. Those too weak to stand were given encouraging words and promises to return, though Jedediah wondered if such promises could be kept. Outside, the compound had erupted into chaos. Guards were shouting, running between buildings, some firing at shadows. A bell had begun to ring, an alarm calling all hands to action. Time to go, Jedediah said, as the last mobile prisoner was freed. There were 12 in all, weak, but determined, their eyes burning with the prospect of freedom. They emerged from the barracks to find Collins and the older Apache approaching, laden with an assortment of weapons, knives, a few old pistols, even some traditional Apache lances and bows. These were quickly distributed among the freed prisoners. The women's barracks, Adsila asked, her expression fierce. Jedediah nodded toward the adjacent building. Same procedure, quick and quiet as possible. They repeated the process, freeing those women and older children who could walk. The scene inside was, if anything, more harrowing than the men's quarters. Many of the women bore signs of abuse beyond simple imprisonment. Their gratitude as the chains fell away was palpable, their determination to escape evident in the way they gathered their strength and moved toward the door, despite their weakened state. By the time they emerged, their group had grown to nearly 30, a ragged, battered assembly united by the desperate desire for freedom. Jedediah led them toward the arsenal and the tunnel entrance, keeping to the shadows where possible, though concealment was increasingly difficult with such numbers. They were halfway across the compound when a commanding voice rang out from the direction of Blackburn's house. "Thornton, I know it's you." Jedediah turned to see Colonel Blackburn standing on his porch rifle in hand, flanked by several guards. The man had aged since their last meeting, his hair now more gray than black, but his bearing remained as arrogant as ever. "Take the others to the tunnel," Jedediah instructed Collins quietly. "I'll deal with Blackburn." "Not alone," Adsila said, stepping to his side. Aoti joined her, his face set in grim determination. Jedediah didn't argue. The three of them moved forward to face Blackburn, while Collins led the rest of the freed prisoners toward the arsenal. "I should have known Matthews couldn't be trusted." Blackburn said, his tone conversational despite the circumstances. "Always was soft on the Indians. But you, Thornton, I expected better. We were comrades once." "Oh, we were never comrades," Jedediah replied, keeping his rifle trained on Blackburn's chest. "I was just another tool to you like all your men." Blackburn smiled thinly. "Tools serve a purpose. You served yours well enough until you developed a conscience." His gaze shifted to Adsila and Iote. "And now you're throwing your lot in with savages. How far you've fallen." "Not as far as you," Jedediah countered. "Treason, Blackburn. Selling weapons to enemies of the United States. That's what they hang men for." Blackburn's smile didn't waver. "Prove it. Your word against mine, Thornton. A disgraced scout versus a decorated officer. Who do you think they'll believe?" "Not just his word," said a voice from behind Blackburn. Thomas Matthews stepped onto the porch, his weathered face grim in the moonlight. He held a pistol, but it wasn't pointed at Jedediah. It was aimed squarely at Blackburn's back. "The ledger, Thornton," Matthews said. "Did you find it?" Jedediah patted his shirt where the book was hidden. "Got it right here. Complete record of every illegal transaction." Blackburn's composure slipped for the first time. "Matthews, you treacherous old fool. I took you in when no one else would have you." "But you used me," Matthews corrected, "like you use everyone. But I've been keeping my own records. Names, dates, witnesses. Enough to see you hang 10 times over." For a moment, the tableau held Blackburn caught between Matthews' pistol and Jedediah's rifle. His guards uncertain without direct orders. Then one of the men flanking Blackburn made a fatal mistake. He raised his rifle toward Matthews. Jedediah fired first, the shot catching the guard in the shoulder and spinning him around. The man's rifle discharged into the air as he fell. The sound broke the stillness, and suddenly everyone was moving. Blackburn dove for cover as Matthews fired the bullet, splintering the door frame where the colonel had been standing an instant before. The remaining guards scattered, some taking up defensive positions, others fleeing into the night. Jedediah pushed Adsila and Iote toward the arsenal. "Go get to the tunnel." They hesitated only briefly before obeying, running in a low crouch toward the building where Collins and the others had already disappeared. Jedediah provided covering fire, forcing the guards to keep their heads down. Matthews had taken cover behind a water barrel at the edge of the porch. He caught Jedediah's eye and nodded toward the arsenal, indicating he should follow Adsila and Iote. Jedediah shook his head. He wouldn't leave the old soldier behind. Instead, he began moving laterally, keeping his rifle trained on the porch while working his way toward Matthews' position. A bullet kicked up dirt near his feet, another whined past his ear. The guards had recovered from their initial surprise and were returning fire in earnest. Jedediah dropped to one knee, steadied his aim, and shot a guard who had been targeting Matthews. The man fell with a cry, clutching his leg. Matthews used the distraction to make a break from his position, running toward Jedediah with surprising speed for a man his age. They met behind the shelter of a supply wagon, bullets thudding into the wood around them. The tunnel won't hold them all. Matthews gasped, reloading his pistol with shaking hands. Too narrow, too slow. They'll be picked off as they exit. Jedediah had reached the same conclusion. What's the alternative? The main gate, Matthews replied. Guards there are already engaged with some of the prisoners who went that way. If we can clear it, there's a trail that leads down to the valley. Horses there. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. Jedediah nodded. Let's get to the arsenal first. Redirect Collins and the others. They made their way toward the large building, moving from cover to cover, as guards continued to fire from various positions around the compound. Inside they found Collins, organizing the last of the prisoners into the tunnel. Change of plan, Jedediah announced. Tunnel's too slow. We're heading for the main gate. Collins looked skeptical. That's the most heavily guarded point. Not anymore, Matthews assured him. Most of the guards are scattered, responding to multiple threats, and I've got men waiting in the valley with horses. Your men? Jedediah asked, surprised. Matthews offered a grim smile. Federal agents. Been in position for days waiting for my signal. This wasn't as impromptu as you might think, Thornton. The revelation that the entire escape had been part of a larger federal operation momentarily stunned Jedediah, but there was no time to dwell on it. They quickly reorganized, bringing everyone out of the tunnel and forming them into a more defensible group. Adsila and Iote took charge of the weakest prisoners, supporting them between stronger individuals. Collins and Matthews distributed the remaining weapons, ensuring that at least every third person was armed in some fashion. Stay together, Jedediah instructed the group. Anyone who can shoot form the outer perimeter. The rest of you stay in the center. We move as one unit to the gate. They exited the arsenal as a group, moving with as much speed as their weakest members could manage. Jedediah and Collins took the lead with Matthews and several armed Apache forming the rear guard. Adsila and Iote kept the central group moving, encouraging those who faltered. Guards fired from various positions, but their shots were largely ineffective against the massed group. Those prisoners with weapons returned fire, forcing the guards to keep their distance. They were halfway to the gate when Blackburn reappeared this time, mounted on a large black horse. He carried a rifle in one hand and a revolver in the other, and his face was contorted with rage. "Kill them all," he shouted to his remaining men. "No witnesses." His appearance rallied the guards, who began a more coordinated attack. Bullets whined through the air with increasing frequency, and one of the freed prisoners fell with a cry of pain. Jedediah took careful aim at Blackburn, but the colonel was a moving target, guiding his horse with his knees as he fired into the group of escapees. Before Jedediah could squeeze the trigger, Blackburn had disappeared behind one of the buildings. "Nor keep moving," Jedediah urged the group. "The gate's just ahead." They could see it now, a large wooden structure set into a palisade that surrounded the entire compound. 2 guards lay dead before it, evidence of earlier fighting. The gate itself stood partially open, just wide enough for one person at a time to slip through. The first of the prisoners reached the opening and began to file through. Jedediah, Collins, and the armed Apache formed a protective semicircle covering their escape. Suddenly, from their left came the thunder of hooves. Blackburn had circled around and was charging toward them, firing as he rode. 2 more prisoners fell, and Collins staggered as a bullet grazed his arm. Adsila, who had been helping an elderly woman through the gate, turned at the sound. In one fluid motion, she drew the knife Jedediah had given her and threw it with deadly accuracy. The blade struck Blackburn's horse in the neck, causing the animal to rear in pain and confusion. Blackburn fought to control his mount, momentarily distracted. It was the opening Jedediah needed. He raised his rifle, aimed carefully, and fired. The shot struck Blackburn in the chest, knocking him backward off his horse. He hit the ground hard, his weapons flying from his hands. For a moment, he lay still. Then, to Jedediah's astonishment, he began to rise, one hand pressed to his bleeding chest. Thornton. He gasped, his face a mask of hatred. You're dead, you and everyone you care about. He fumbled at his belt, drawing a small derringer that had been hidden there. Before he could aim it, another shot rang out. Blackburn jerked and then collapsed, a red stain spreading across his back. Matthews stood a few yards away. His pistol still raised smoke curling from its barrel. That's for all the men you sacrificed, the old soldier said quietly. And for Thornton's family. Jedediah looked at him sharply. What do you mean for my family? Matthews's weathered face showed a mixture of regret and grim satisfaction. The fever that took your wife and son? It wasn't natural. Blackburn had them poisoned. His way of punishing you for testifying against him. The confirmation of his long-held suspicion hit Jedediah like a physical blow. He had known somewhere deep inside, but hearing it stated so plainly made the loss fresh again. How do you know this? He demanded. Because I delivered the medicine that killed them. Matthews admitted, his voice heavy with remorse. I didn't know what it was at the time. By the time I figured it out, it was too late. I've been trying to make amends ever since. The world seemed to narrow to this single moment of revelation. Jedediah felt a surge of rage so intense it threatened to consume him. His rifle came up, pointing at Matthew's heart. You helped kill my family, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Matthews didn't flinch. Yes, and I've lived with that knowledge every day since. Kill me if you must, Thornton. I won't stop you. But do it after these people are safe. Adsila's hand on his arm broke through the haze of anger. Jedediah, she said softly, using his given name for the first time. Not now. Others need you. He looked at her. Then at the remaining prisoners, still filing through the gate at Ioti, supporting an injured man, at Collins, binding his wounded arm with a strip of cloth. All depending on him to see them to safety. Slowly, the rifle lowered. This isn't finished, he told Matthews. I know, the old soldier replied. But let's finish the rescue first. The temporary truce established, they turned their attention back to the escape. The last of the prisoners were through the gate, now leaving only Jedediah, Adsila, Ioti, Collins, and Matthews. Go, Matthews urged them. I'll hold them off as long as I can. You're coming with us, Collins insisted. I need your testimony to bring charges against anyone connected to this operation. Matthews shook his head. There are still prisoners in there who couldn't walk. I won't leave them to die. Then I'm staying too, Jedediah decided. No, Matthews said firmly. You've done your part. Get these people to safety. That's an order, Scout. The use of his old military designation sparked a reflexive response in Jedediah, an instinct to obey despite everything. He hesitated, torn between the need to see the freed prisoners to safety and the desire to finish what they had started. Adsila settled the matter. More guards coming, she warned, pointing to a group of men emerging from the barracks area. Must go now. Jedediah made his decision. We'll come back with help, he promised Matthews. Hold out till then. The old soldier nodded, already taking up a defensive position beside the gate. "Get moving, Thornton. Dawn's coming." Jedediah, Adsila, Iote, and Collins slipped through the gate and joined the stream of freed prisoners making their way down the mountain trail. Behind them, the sound of gunfire continued as Matthews engaged the pursuing guards. The trail was steep and treacherous in the pre-dawn darkness, made more difficult by the weakened condition of many escapees. They had to stop frequently to rest, each delay increasing the risk of capture. But somehow they kept moving, the promise of freedom driving them forward when strength alone would have failed. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, they reached the valley Matthews had described. And there, as promised, waited a group of mounted men, a dozen federal agents led by a stern-faced individual who introduced himself as Chief Marshal Dawson. "Collins," the man acknowledged, dismounting to help his injured colleague. "Thought we'd lost you." "Nearly did," Collins replied grimly. "If not for Thornton and the Apache woman, none of us would have made it out." Dawson turned his attention to Jedediah. "You have the evidence Matthews mentioned." Jedediah produced the ledger from inside his shirt. "All here. Complete record of Blackburn's operations." The marshal examined the book briefly, his expression hardening as he turned the pages. "This is more than enough. Good work." He looked up at the trail they had descended. "Matthews stayed behind to cover our escape," Collins reported. "There are still prisoners up there who couldn't walk. He wouldn't leave them." Dawson nodded, unsurprised. "Sounds like him. Always was stubborn about finishing a job." He turned to his men. "Johnson, Davis, take care of these people. Get them food, water, medical attention. The rest of you mount up. We're going back for Matthews and the others." Jedediah stepped forward. "I'm coming with you." The marshal assessed him with a critical eye, noting his exhaustion and the determination in his stance. "Can you still shoot straight?" "Straight enough," Jedediah assured him. "Then find yourself a horse." Dawson turned to Adsila and Iote. "What about you two?" Brother and sister exchanged a glance, some unspoken communication passing between them. Then Iote spoke his English, careful but clear. "My sister stay. Help wounded. I go. Show way." Dawson nodded his acceptance of this arrangement. Jedediah caught Adsila's eyes, silently questioning her decision to stay behind. She approached him as he was mounting a horse provided by one of the agents. "Iote know way better," she explained. "Adsila, more help here." She reached up, touching his arm lightly. "You come back." It wasn't a question, but Jedediah answered anyway. "I'll come back." The rescue party, now numbering Dawson, his agents Jedediah and Iote, rode back up the mountain trail at a gallop. The sun was fully above the horizon by the time they reached the camp, illuminating a scene of chaos. The gate stood open, several bodies, guards, and prisoners alike scattered around it. Of Matthews, there was no sign. Inside the compound, a building was burning, thick, black smoke rising into the morning sky. Gunfire could be heard from the direction of the prisoner barracks. "Spread out," Dawson ordered his men. "Secure the perimeter. Johnson, Peters with me to the barracks. Thornton, you and the Apache check Blackburn's house. Anyone surrenders, take them alive. Anyone resists." He left the implication hanging. Jedediah and Iote moved cautiously toward Blackburn's house, covering each other as they advanced. The building appeared deserted, its door standing open. Inside they found signs of hasty departure, drawers, pulled out papers, scattered valuables gone. "Someone left in a hurry," Jedediah observed. Iote nodded, his attention caught by something on Blackburn's desk. He picked up a small object, examining it briefly before handing it to Jedediah. It was a pocket watch silver with a distinctive engraving on the case. Jedediah recognized it immediately. It had belonged to his father, passed down to him, and then stolen along with other valuables when his cabin was ransacked after his family's deaths. Blackburn Iote said his meaning clear. Jedediah slipped the watch into his pocket, another piece of evidence linking Blackburn to the tragedy that had altered the course of his life. But there would be time for reflection later. Now they needed to find Matthews and the remaining prisoners. They rejoined Dawson at the barracks, where a brief but intense firefight had ended with the surrender of the few remaining guards. Matthews was there wounded, but alive, tending to a group of prisoners too ill or injured to have joined the earlier escape. "Took you long enough." The old soldier greeted them, pressing a blood-soaked cloth to a wound in his side. "They had to round up the cavalry," Jedediah replied, kneeling beside him to examine the injury. It was serious, but not immediately life-threatening. "You'll live to testify." Matthews grimaced. "Not sure that's a comfort." The remaining prisoners were carefully evacuated, loaded onto horses or makeshift stretchers. The camp was thoroughly searched, yielding additional evidence of Blackburn's crimes records correspondence, even a private journal detailing operations too sensitive to include in the official ledger. By midday, they were ready to leave. Dawson ordered the weapons cache destroyed and the building secured for later investigation. The bodies of those who had fallen, guards and prisoners alike, were identified and recorded for official reports. Jedediah found himself standing at the spot where Blackburn had fallen. The colonel's body was gone, presumably removed by his men during the night. The bloodstain remained already turning brown in the mountain sun. "He's not dead," Matthews said, coming to stand beside him. The old soldier had been patched up by one of Dawson's men, and though pale from blood loss, was on his feet again. "What?" Jedediah turned to him, disbelieving. "I saw you shoot him." "I saw him carried away," Matthews replied. "He was hit bad, might still die, but he wasn't dead when they took him." The news settled heavily on Jedediah's shoulders. If Blackburn lived, he would remain a threat not just to the legal case against him, but to everyone involved in his downfall. "We'll find him," Dawson assured them, having overheard the exchange. "A man like that wounded on the run, he won't get far." Jedediah wasn't so certain, but he kept his doubts to himself. There was nothing more to be done here. The journey back to the valley was slower than the ascent, burdened as they were with wounded and ill prisoners. Matthews rode double with one of the agents, his face gray with pain, but his eyes alert, missing nothing. As they descended, Jedediah found himself riding alongside Iote. The Apache man had been quiet throughout the second raid, speaking only when necessary. Now he broke his silence. "You helped my sister," he said, his English improving with use. "Help my people. Why?" It was a fair question, one Jedediah had asked himself more than once since finding Adsila by the ravine. It seemed like the right thing to do, he answered, echoing what he had told her days ago. Aote studied him thoughtfully. "Right thing costs much," he said, repeating Adsila's words. "You lose more than gain." Jedediah thought of his isolated cabin, his solitary existence, the years spent nursing grief and guilt. He thought of the ledger now in Dawson's possession, the watch in his pocket, the confirmation of Blackburn's role in his family's deaths. And he thought of Adsila's quiet strength, her determination, her hand on his arm, when rage threatened to overwhelm him. "Maybe," he conceded. "But sometimes the cost of doing nothing is higher." Aote seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. My father say same. Cost him life. Your father sounds like a wise man. The Aote agreed. Die protecting children from soldiers, like your Matthews. He believe in right thing more than safe thing. The comparison between Matthews and Aote's father was unexpected, forcing Jedediah to reconsider his feelings toward the old soldier. Matthews had been complicit in the deaths of Rebecca and Samuel Yes. But he had spent years trying to make amends, putting himself at risk to gather evidence against Blackburn to help the prisoners to arrange this rescue. Did that excuse his actions? No. But perhaps it offered a path forward that didn't end in more bloodshed. They reached the valley to find a makeshift camp established. Tents had been erected, fires built, food prepared. The freed prisoners were being tended by a doctor who had accompanied Dawson's men, and their wounds dressed, their immediate needs addressed. Adsila was moving among them, offering water-adjusting bandages, speaking words of comfort in Apache. She looked up as the rescue party arrived, her eyes quickly finding Jedediah. The relief in her expression when she saw him was unmistakable. She came to him as he dismounted, her gaze taking in his exhausted state, the blood on his clothes, none of it his own, thankfully. You return, she said simply. I said I would. He nodded toward Aote, who was already being surrounded by grateful fellow prisoners. Your brother's quite a guide. Couldn't have done it without him. She followed his gaze, a rare smile softening her features as she watched. Aote, he's strong like father. So I've heard, and like his sister. Her eyes returned to his searching. What happened? Blackburn dead? Wounded but alive, Jedediah replied, seeing no reason to soften the truth. They took him when they retreated. She absorbed this with a slight tightening of her jaw. He come back, for revenge. Possibly, but he'll be a wanted man hunted by federal marshals. His influence, his protection, it's gone. Not all gone, she said with the certainty of one who had seen too much of the world's injustice. Men like Blackburn have friends, powerful friends. She wasn't wrong. Even with the evidence they had gathered, bringing Blackburn to justice would not be simple. There would be those who would protect him, either out of loyalty or because they were implicated in his crimes. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it, Jedediah said. For now, let's focus on getting these people to safety. Dawson approached them, his expression grim but satisfied. Good work up there, Thornton. You too, ma'am. He added with a respectful nod to Adsila. We'll be moving out in an hour, taking the prisoners to Fort Laramie for medical care, then helping them return to their people if they wish. And Matthews, Jedediah asked, coming with us to testify. After that, Dawson shrugged. That'll be for a judge to decide. His help in this matter will count in his favor, but he was still part of Blackburn's operation for years. It was a reminder that justice was seldom simple or complete. Matthews would face consequences for his actions, as he should. But the man who had orchestrated it all, who had ordered the deaths of Jedediah's family, who had imprisoned and abused dozens of innocent people, that man was still free. Dawson seemed to read his thoughts. We'll find Blackburn, he promised. Every marshal in the territory will be looking for him. He won't get far. Jedediah nodded, accepting the assurance for what it was, a hope rather than a certainty. What about Adsila and Aote, the other Apache? They're free to go where they please, Dawson said, though I'd advise staying clear of the reservations for a while. There might be repercussions once word gets out about what happened here. Adsila exchanged a glance with Jedediah. Where we go? She asked softly. It was a question that had been forming in his mind since they had found the abandoned cabin. A question about the future, about possibilities he had long since stopped considering. "I have a place," he said. "It's not much, but it's quiet, safe, room enough for 2 or 3, he added with a nod toward Iote. She studied him for a long moment, her dark eyes unreadable. Then she glanced at her brother, who had approached silently and stood listening to their conversation. Iote spoke in Apache, a brief sentence that made Adsila smile. She replied in the same language, then turned back to Jedediah. "Iote say he go to mountains, find others who escaped before, build new life away from soldiers, away from reservations." Her expression grew thoughtful. "He asked if I go too." Jedediah felt a weight settle in his chest. Of course she would want to be with her brother, with her people. It was natural, right? He had no claim on her, no reason to expect anything else. "And what did you tell him?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Her answer was direct, her gaze steady on his. "I tell him my path different now. I find new home with Tinza, who save Adsila." The weight lifted, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years. A lightness, a sense of possibility. "You're sure?" She nodded, her decision clearly made. "Iote understand. He visit when can. Bring others, maybe, who need safe place." Jedediah looked at Iote, wanting to be certain there was no resentment. The taller man met his gaze directly, then extended his hand in the white man's gesture of agreement. "You protect my sister," Iote said. "She protect you. Good trade." Jedediah clasped his hand, feeling the strength in the other man's grip. "Good trade," he agreed. The agreement settled, and they turned their attention to the immediate needs of the moment, helping the wounded onto wagons Dawson had procured, gathering what supplies could be spared for Iote and those who would join him in the mountains, saying goodbyes to those they had fought beside. Matthews approached as they were preparing to depart, his face pale but determined. "Thornton," he said a word. Jedediah stepped aside with him, aware of Adsila watching from where she stood with Iote. "I know nothing I can say will make right what I did," Matthews began. "But I want you to know I've carried that weight every day. It's why I stayed with Blackburn, why I gathered evidence, why I reached out to the marshals. Not just for the Apache prisoners, but for your family." Jedediah studied the old soldier, seeing the genuine remorse in his weathered face. "Why didn't you tell me sooner, when you first suspected what Blackburn had done?" "Fear," Matthews admitted candidly. "Fear and shame. By the time I pieced it together, you had already gone into seclusion, and approaching you meant admitting my part in it." He sighed heavily. "I was a coward, Thornton. No excuse for it." The admission was stark in its honesty. Jedediah found his anger tempered by an unexpected understanding. Not forgiveness, not yet perhaps, not ever completely, but enough to move forward. "What will you do after you testify?" he asked. Matthews shrugged, wincing at the movement. "If they don't hang me, find some quiet corner to live out whatever time I have left. Try to do more good than harm for a change." "And there's a valley east of here," Jedediah found himself saying. "Good waters sheltered. Abandoned cabin that could be fixed up without too much trouble." The old soldier looked at him in surprise. "You're suggesting I settle near you after everything?" "Nay, not too near," Jedediah clarified. "But within riding distance, in case there's ever a need." Matthews considered this, then nodded slowly. "I'll think on it. And Thornton, thank you for not shooting me when you had the chance." "Wasn't for lack of wanting to," Jedediah admitted. But Adsila was right. There'd been enough killing. They rejoined the others as final preparations were being made. Dawson's men were mounted and ready, the wagons loaded with those too weak to ride. Collins, his arm properly bandaged now, was conferring with Dawson about their route to Fort Laramie. Aote had gathered a small group of the stronger Apache men and women who had elected to join him in the mountains. They stood apart, already preparing mentally for a different journey than the one to the fort. Ready? Jedediah asked Adsila as he led Thunder and the bay mare from where they had been tethered. She nodded, accepting his help to mount the smaller horse. Her wound was healing well, her movements growing more fluid each day. She sat straight in the saddle, no longer the desperate fugitive he had found in the ravine, but a woman who had reclaimed her freedom and chosen her path. They said their goodbyes to Aote with promises of future visits, to Dawson and Collins with assurances that they would be available to testify if needed, to Matthews with the acknowledgement that some debts could never be fully repaid, but that the attempt mattered. As they rode away from the temporary camp, Jedediah found himself looking not back at what they were leaving, but forward to what might lie ahead. The sun was high, the valley stretching before them, green and vibrant with spring growth. Beside him, Adsila rode with the same forward focus, her profile strong against the landscape. "Long ride to cabin," she observed. "A day and a half," he confirmed. "We'll camp tonight, reach home tomorrow." She considered this. "Home," she repeated, testing the word. "Good word." Jedediah thought of his cabin, standing empty and silent in its clearing. It had been a shelter, a place to exist, but not truly a home, not since Rebecca and Samuel had died. Perhaps with Adsila, it could be something more. "It will be," he promised, both to her and to himself. "It will be." They rode on as the day waned, two figures growing smaller against the vast landscape, yet somehow more significant than they had been before. Behind them lay the past with its grief and pain, its unfinished business and unsettled debts. Before them stretched a future uncertain, but full of possibility, a path chosen rather than merely endured. And between them, unspoken but growing stronger with each mile, the understanding that neither would walk that path alone.